Hi, my name is Ned Saleh. I'm a scientist and I am the founder of Sensop. This is part 2 of our model-independent analysis where we address a $7 trillion question. We will show how to test the entire United States in 30 days and eradicate COVID-19 in a maximum of 60 days, without the need for a vaccine or even increasing our current level of testing. We will demonstrate how we can predict COVID-19 infections, hospitalization, and fatalities with high statistical confidence level, using analysis with modest skill for just about anyone to be able to produce on their own. We will provide analytical tools that will be very useful for decision makers and analysts. We will provide an estimate of the total COVID-19 infections in the USA, which turns out to be 10 times more than the reported values. We will also demonstrate that the risk of dying of COVID-19 is comparable to dying from an automobile accident. And we will address an important question of what will happen with COVID-19 by the next flu season based on the available data from the CDC and compare that to the last known pandemic from just 10 years ago, which was the swine flu, whose vaccine was developed in about 5 months. Furthermore, we will demonstrate how the country's approach to COVID-19 is fundamentally flawed, and the new approach we propose is based on inverting the curve rather than flattening the curve. Finally, we will see how contact tracing or establishing risk scores does not compromise privacy and how we can get everybody to participate. Using data and predictive analysis is the 21st century equivalent of lockdowns and quarantines, only if we use the full potential of the data that we have access to. You will not find this analysis anywhere else. Stay tuned. This analysis is model independent. It's accurate, it relies only on daily recorded raw data, and can be reproduced by anyone. It does not depend on the COVID-19 number of tests or the test rates. So if the test numbers are high or low, or they are increasing or decreasing, you will not see any of the artifact here. So what we've seen in the past, where the models that were used varied by almost 1,000 times, none of that will be here. It also does not depend on the mitigation effort. So distancing, wearing masks or not, all that is baked into this analysis. It predicts infections, hospitalizations, and fatalities with high confidence level. The proposal that we're offering does not require therapeutics, vaccines, or more testing. No lockdowns or shutdowns will be needed in any sector. It can be extended to other countries and future pandemics. It creates a more useful, trackable, programmable, and predictive recovery metric better than the flatten the curve. Actually, we call it inverting the curve, and it's a paradigm shift. It proposes less than 60 days to eradicate COVID-19 from the USA, and it was valid since April. So we start by pulling the raw data from any source. Now remember, because we have made the COVID test free and open to all, we created a nationwide randomized sample. It may not be quite random, might be some bias, but it's randomized. Actually, it turns out that we're wasting more than 90% of our testing resources. Now with this trend, more testing means more waste of test results, and this pattern has been going on since April. Now, what you would see typically in the media is these two curves. For example, what we're showing here from the New York Times is the number of cases and the number of fatalities. And they seem to be aligned and synchronized, which gives you the impression that these are the cases and fatalities that happen on a given day. Now we're going to show you that this is not accurate and actually it's misguiding. So what we're going to do, we're going to take the number of positive cases and divide them by the number of total tests and the number of fatalities and divide them by the total test, and it will also show the current hospitalization level. Now remember, the blue color is the positive divided by all tests, and the green color and the 10. So when we do this, we end up with this curve. So as we can see here, the new deaths per test is that green column that we showed. So we divide the reported fatalities and we divide them by the total number of tests. And we show the total number of positives and we divide that by the number of tests. That's the blue curve here. And we show the total number of current hospitalization. So this is organized here by date. And these two curves are tracked here on this logarithmic vertical axis to the left. And the current hospitalization levels are tracked here on this axis with the absolute number. So what will happen if we actually push back the hospitalization and the fatalities by a little bit and see what happens here in these curves? Well, if we push them back by 1 week for the hospitalization level and about a month for the fatalities, we will see how the curves now synchronize. And that makes sense because it takes about 1 week for those who got infected to be hospitalized and about a month for those who were hospitalized to unfortunately pass if their symptoms became that bad. So again, we just push back by 1 week, by 1 week and 1 month, and we end up now with a better curve and also more meaningful. So remember, from part 1, what we said is that this curve becomes really the efficiency of testing. It tells us how many of the total tests are positive, and as you can see here, we started with 20%, went down to 5%, now we are about 7%. But it also gives you a historical probability curve of infections. So this is the probability of infection at a given day because of the way we collected data and we randomized our samples. It also tells you about the risk of being infected at this given day and also in the future. Similar argument can be made regarding fatalities. This is the historical probability curve of fatalities after infection, and it's also the risk of dying post-infection. So these are very important metric curves that provide probabilities and show the correlations between all these phenomena. We also learn when we display the data this way that during the lockdown and the reopening, the reproductive number, for example, became less than 1 here, which makes perfect sense. And when we started reopening, the reproductive number became more than 1. And as we mentioned, these curves are correlated. Actually, the 3-way correlation and also the 2-way piecewise or pairwise correlation is statistically up to 80%. These curves are not just numerical coincidences. These are descriptions of statistical processes that are interrelated. So people infect each other, and this curve flows, as we can see here, over the entire period of pandemic propagation in the US. And after infection, people go to hospitals if their symptoms get very bad. And then ultimately, a subset of these cohorts end up, unfortunately, dying. So these are interrelated statistical processes that are highly correlated, which makes sense. Now, we're going to look at how far back these correlations took place. And we will find out that these correlations were happening since late March. And as you can see here, these correlations, these curves roll out with date since late March till today, basically late August. So these correlations were observed since March. They described interrelated statistical processes. And again, this is model-less extrapolation here that we show you that's based solely on the predictive power of the statistics and also on the extrapolations that we can fit here. So as you can see, we can actually create mathematical fits and predict future, perhaps within 5 to 7 days of infections. Again, infection happens here because people infect each other within the United States. Now, perhaps one point may not mean much, but in the broader context of what this curve means, probabilities of infection, and people infecting each other, we can actually make this claim that we can project and predict the number of infections in the upcoming maybe 5 to 7 days. Similarly, we can also predict the corresponding hospitalization that follows these infections. And the way we're displaying the data now, each point here represents a cohort of people who actually get infected, and these are the same subset of people whose symptoms become very bad, and then they have to be hospitalized, and eventually they will have to pass. Because of the way we displayed the data and synchronized it, we can make these predictions about infections, hospitalization, and ultimately fatalities. So someone might ask, how do you compare that to the actual number of fatalities? Well, the data corroborates these correlations. For example, if we display here the new reported deaths per day per new positive. So every death here is a subset of these infections, and they are synchronized and displayed day by day. And as you can see here, the probability that actually someone that was infected and passed tracked here on this curve, this probability or percentage is also correlated to the rest of other curves, obviously with high confidence level. And if we also display the actual number of fatalities in absolute numbers, it's also correlated with the probability of someone being infected, someone passes after being infected. And again, we can establish predictions in the future based on the predictive and extrapolation analysis. Again, this is model independent and depends on the raw data. So it's really difficult to argue if this data is accurate or not. So now we will give an estimate, as we did in part 1 of this video, of the real and total number of infections in the US. Now again, as we established in part 1, that the probability of infections, also the efficiency of testing. So as you can see here, we started in late March with really low efficiency. 80% of the tests were negative. These are tests we're not supposed to do in the first place. We shouldn't be testing people who are negative, and we will not really learn much from a large number of people who turned out to be negative, actually the majority. And we went down to end of August, and still the percentage, the positivity is still low. However, as we said before, that this represents the probability of infections out there. So if we go out and try to find out if we can measure everybody at that point, but because of the randomized sample, this becomes only a probability. Now, if we assume that the infection cycle is about 30 days, on average, just to simplify the numbers, the positivity rate or the probability that someone is infected out there is represented by this curve. We can imagine that we went through 4 full cycles or 4 months at an average of 10% of the total US population. Now, 10% of the US population at 330 million is about 33 million. And over 4 complete cycles, that's a little over 120 million people who are expected to be infected. However, if we assume 50% bias of the sample, where people were asked to go and get tested, and some people were tested twice, if we add 50% of the bias here, we'll end up with 60 million total infections. This is about 10 times the official number, little over 5 million by the end of August. Now, let's look carefully at the numbers and try to learn more about a summary from raw data. Well, we tested a little over 20% of the US population. That's a lot of people, almost 70 million people that we have tested since early March. And the total infections so far, cumulatively, is about 1.68%. Cumulatively, this includes people who were infected and recovered. It remains relatively in the low single-digit percentage. And the total deaths for the entire US population is 0.05%. It's obviously a small number, and this is the cumulative reported COVID-19 fatalities. Now, in order to understand what this really means, so if someone is not in a nursing home, because 40% of fatalities in the US from COVID are from nursing homes, or the person is not suffering any underlying conditions like cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, or hypertension, or cancer, or equivalently, the person is below retirement age, these conditions somehow are equivalent. If none of these conditions apply, the COVID-19 fatality risk is about 0.02%. This is actually comparable to dying from an automobile accident. So as we can see here, the real risk of dying of COVID is low. It's comparable to dying from an automobile accident. Now, the other thing that we need to mention about reporting COVID fatalities is comorbidity, which means in simple terms that someone has multiple medical conditions that are a risk to their lives. And a certain trigger happens and people ended up dying because of these underlying conditions. We actually look at the CDC data for all fatalities in the US since early this year and subtract that from only COVID-19 fatalities that were reported. The interesting results that we'll find here is that we will end up with this curve where you can see that there's about 70% correlations between COVID deaths and other normal deaths. Now remember, these are the normal deaths other than COVID after subtracting COVID. But it's obvious that there is a correlation. So it looks like the COVID fatalities were not really calculated correctly, and we still have high correlation between other normal fatalities and COVID death. So we need to look into this carefully and do a better job of reporting the actual fatalities that were caused by COVID-19. And this tells us that the number of fatalities of COVID-19s because of comorbidity were not reported properly. And the real number of COVID fatalities, meaning that those who would otherwise not pass, not die because of COVID-19, would only die because of that, removing comorbidities is probably a lot less than the reported number. So we address now another question about what will happen in the next flu season. Well, if we look at the last pandemic just 10 years ago, which is the swine flu, what we find out is that ultimately the swine flu became part of the seasonal flu cycle. Now, the swine flu is also a zoonotic virus, just like SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19. It comes from swine or pigs, and it jumps to humans. H1N1 is also another name for the virus that causes swine flu. Was first seen in the US in 2009. It's believed that it was originated from the US or Mexico around that date. It infected 1 billion people with a bee globally, including 60 million in the US, and that's higher in percentage than the Spanish flu. The swine flu killed 600,000 people globally, approximately, including 18,000 here in the USA. The vaccine was developed and approved also in the same year of October of 2009, after about 5 months of the first occurrence of the swine flu pandemic. Let's look at some numbers for the swine flu. So what we are looking at right here is the number of infections from the CDC data on this vertical curve versus time displayed here in the number of weeks. So number 1 is week number 1, is the beginning of January, and week number 5 here is the beginning of February, and week number 9 is the beginning of March, and so forth. And these are the various families of the flu. So before 2009, obviously, 2006, 2007, the swine flu here in tan was not discovered yet. And this is across all age groups, but we will only look now for simplicity at the younger age. So 2006, 2007, it was a normal flu season. It started in winter and it faded away at the beginning of the summer, and it has all the flu families. The year after, 2007, 2008, again, it's another flu season. Look at the numbers here, around 300 infections. And it's a combination of the various flu family. So 2008, 2009, again, this is the normal flu season that starts in winter. But we notice here that the swine flu started appearing actually in the summer. And we started looking at it right here. And you can see how it's almost 3 times the number of infections of the other families of the seasonal flu. Now, 2009, 2010, this is the second wave in winter of the swine flu. And it's almost twice as the first wave, as we can see here. This is about 600 here. And the next wave in the winter is almost twice. So this is the second wave of the swine flu, even though the vaccine was introduced in October. Let's move forward to 2010, 2011. The new flu season went back almost roughly to the same levels, maybe a little bit higher, and the swine flu blended within the family of the other flus, with the other flu viruses. As we can see here, the red is AH3, and that was the distribution of infections. But look at the level here, it's 500. Now we move on to 2012, 2013. Again, swine flu disappeared from this seasonal flu cycle. We don't see it here at the tan. We see AH3 as the common element in the seasonal flu cycle. Move forward to 2014, 2015, again, back to the almost same levels of the seasonal flu, which happens in winter and fades away in the summer. And it's mostly dominated in this year by the AH3 virus. Moving forward, 2015, 2016, again, swine flu became, over this year, the major component of the seasonal flu. And again, starting to appear in winter, fading away around summer, just a normal flu cycle. In 2016, 2017, again, swine flu is not part of this seasonal flu cycle, but the AH3 is the dominant one. 2017, 2018, again, at 300, kind of normal flu cycle in winter, goes away in summer, and the swine flu is now mixed with others. 2018, 2019, we noticed that the swine flu came back and was part of this cycle. But again, it's the normal flu cycle, starts in the winter, fades away in the summer. 2019, 2020, we see again almost normal, around 300 to 400, maybe a little bit over average. Again, we see here that the influenza B is common here, and it shares the distribution of the normal flu cycle with the swine flu. Now, we know around this time there's an outbreak here of COVID-19, but for some reason, CDC did not update their cycle. So let's look at the swine flu carefully again. So this is the seasonal flu here in November of 2008, and then in May of 2009, this was the first wave of the swine flu, and the second wave started here, as we indicated, around October of 2009, even though the vaccine was introduced, and the second wave was even larger. So all in all, swine flu was about 4 times the number of cases for the seasonal flu. And we do expect, based on that, based on the similarities between COVID-19 and the swine flu, that COVID-19 will blend with the seasonal flu cycle, especially with the ongoing mitigation measures, therapeutic, and maybe some preliminary vaccine. And what we will probably see as a prediction is that the flu cycle will be similar to the normal cycles after the COVID-19 blends with other families of flu, and we will see it year in, year out, as is the case with the swine flu. Now, we talk now about how the US is on the wrong path to address COVID-19. Flattening the curve is a fundamentally flawed approach. A better approach is inverting the curve, and we'll talk about that. Lockdowns and shutdowns are not needed. Only individuals identified as high risk score or high risk are selectively isolated. All life sectors remain open and fully operational. We are wasting most of our test resources. The positivity rate, which is the percentage of those who are infected or test positive out of the total tests, remain low, indicating that 90% of the tests were not necessary. If we're testing hundreds of thousands of people every day and only 10% of them are positive, there's no reason to find out that 90% were negative in the first place. We should not be testing these people. Now, let's talk more about what flattening the curve means. It basically means that the number of cases, and we're talking only about infections, over time should remain below the health system capacity. Well, what happens if we increase the health system capacity? Would that solve the problem? Well, we did build a lot of field hospitals. We enlisted the military, and we still did not keep the infections below the hospital system capacity. Now, that's not quite understood yet. So how do we implement this? Well, we're supposed to be testing, mitigating, isolating, or locking down. And that's really not a very effective policy, as it turns out to be that we are where we are here today in August. Now, what are the success criteria? The medical community keeps talking about keeping the positivity rate low. How low? Is 0%, where we test people and we keep testing them and no one is infected? Is that success criteria? Then we're wasting all testing and maybe we should stop. But we know that's not the case, and there are people who are infected. So what's the sweet spot? We also know that flattening the curve might work on a small scale. But really, for a big country like the United States, it's very difficult. Now, flattening the curve maintains the area under the curve, which means that the total number of infections does not change. We're only delaying the infections, hoping that something will happen or maybe we can vaccinate. And extensive closures are very problematic. So what we see here is what's called the logistic curve in epidemiology, which is basically how fast people reach their herd immunity. So in cases like New York, where closures and lockdowns were implemented much later, or California, where closures and lockdowns implemented much earlier, what we notice here is that they both eventually reach the same level of herd immunity, even though some of them are delayed over the other one. But really, from the data that we collected, whether the California model or the New York model, the number of infections, again, these are the infections, not the fatalities, the number of infections per capita is the same. In New York, it mostly happened in the beginning. In California, it's happening later. And also, extended lockdowns would cause more problems than the pandemic itself, based on many studies that were performed, including Scott Atlas's group here at Stanford. For example, look at California. California is closing 15 hospitals because the capacity was low. But at the same time, California is implementing lockdowns and closures. Well, you can't have it both ways. And this is another evidence that flattening the curve does not seem to be very well understood. Actually, if you try to understand that further, in terms of keeping the rate of positivity low, it seems to be a major misconception about running out of infection before running out of tests. Even though this is the intention, but what's happening really is that we're running out of tests before we run out of infections. What is the ideal positivity rate? We still don't know. 0% does not make sense, but the medical community continues to require that the lower the positivity rate, the better. So keeping low positivity rates and scaling up the testing is really prohibitive. Even a rich country like the United States cannot keep up with that. And this is the opinion that the medical community and the public health officials seem to subscribe to, not just in the United States, but all over the world. Johns Hopkins, for example, talks about keeping the rate of the positivity low, 10% or even lower, citing the World Health Organization, who also recommends low positivity rates. And here is the US test czar, Admiral Brett Gruor, also talking about how to keep the test rate positivity at 10%. And this represents really the policy of the United States in terms of how to address the testing and the isolation of the COVID-19. Now, there is bad and good positivity low rates. The bad low positivity, which is the status quo in the US right now, is when the samples are too small compared to the infections, in which case we run out of tests before we run out of infections. So if you see the samples that we do today, because we can't test enough people, we have to test millions of people every day, and the results have to be turned around within just a few days, much shorter than the incubation period. This is a scale that we can't reach. We don't have a roadmap. So what we end up doing here is that collecting low samples, the positivity rate, which is the red dots here, end up being artificially low. At the same time, we're leaving most of the population infecting each other. And this is what we have noticed over the past several months of the pandemic. Now, if we do this right, conceptually, the good low positivity rate, which is desired, it requires massive testing resources that we can't achieve in the US. Samples are larger than the infected population, as you can see here, at which case the low positivity rate is good, and we are really running out of infections before we're running out of tests. And again, this is not what's happening. So what is the alternative? The alternative is what we call inverting the curve. It's a new method that we propose. And this is how it works. At the beginning of any pandemic, testing resources are usually scarce. So we start with an initial testing with low positivity rates, percentage of positive tests out of all the tests. We establish risk scores to drive highly biased test sampling, not the way we do it today, which is almost random. Then we proactively and rapidly sift through the entire population, and we test only those who have high risk scores, meaning those who are most likely to infect others. And we drop the other ones who have a low risk score. Our success criteria for inverting the curve of positivity is to turn the positivity from low to high, ideally 100%. And if we are inching up our way towards 100%, this means that we are succeeding. This needs to be done once, unlike flattening the curve model, where testing is required to be done repeatedly, which is very costly. Lockdowns and shutdowns are not needed. Economic sectors remain fully operational. So flattening the curve means keeping the hospitals above the infection rates if we can, but inverting the curve means we start with low positivity, we go up to ideally 100%, at the same time the test levels are dropping. So contact tracing and risk scoring might be similar, but they are actually different. So establishing a risk score, which means basically the probability of infecting others, including asymptomatic people, say goes from 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high. We establish the risk score before infections, during infections, and after infections. It's actually unlike contact tracing, which happens after infections. The risk score is always established. It does not require geolocation. It preserves privacy and is totally de-identified, and the data could be encrypted, and it depends only on proximity. So if a person with high test score comes in proximity with a person of low risk score, what happens is that you can think of it as the person with high risk score will rub it off on the person of low risk score. And then they both are entered into a database for 14 days. We don't know who these people are or where they met, but all we know that they got into proximity of each other, and one of them had a high risk score. After 14 days, this drops, and basically they go back to normal risk score. No manual contact tracing is required for establishing a risk score. It's fully automated. Now, if we implement this on an app, your risk score would show on your app, and it could be accompanied with a color or a QR code. So if someone has a high risk score, we don't allow them to go to schools, malls, or theaters, or games, but the rest of society remains fully open and operational. We just ask these people to quarantine themselves. So how do we get everybody to participate in that? Well, we have to pay people for the fair market value of their data. If this data helps us avert a pandemic and the chaos and the havoc that it wreaks in our economy, then we have to pay the fair market value for that using the cost shifting model. Cost shifting model is similar to what automobile insurance companies pay for good drivers because they help them avoid getting engaged in a car accident. So by the same concept, if this data is going to help us avert economic damage to the tune of multi-trillion dollars, we can divide that damage by the number of US population, about 300 million people, and the remaining would be $5,000 to $10,000 per person per download. So if you have a household of 4 people, you would be paid $10,000. Now, if we need this data, just like eminent domain, and we have to take it from people, we have to pay them that. This is not a stimulus or incentive. This is the fair market value of data. We already paid close to these amounts. Might as well do it based on fair market value of the contract tracing and risk scoring the way we propose it. So how do we put all this together, and how do we test the entire USA in 30 days and eradicate COVID-19 in 60 days? Here's the plan. We remain at the same test levels as they are today. They might even drop a little bit. The efficiency today is 10%. The positivity rate is 10%, meaning 10% of the tests are positive and the rest are negative. People who don't carry the virus should not have been tested in the first place. If we invert the curve, practically what we're doing is that we are effectively increasing the number of tests by a factor of 9 if we go from 10% efficiency to 90% efficiency. So we are going through, instead of about 500,000 or 600,000, we're going through 5 million people a day. We're not testing them all, but we are sifting through them. So we proactively go out, we pre-screen, we triage, and based on the risk scores, we decide who we test. So we go through 9 times or 10 times of 500,000 tests a day. Effectively, we are testing 5 million people. So we sift through the whole nation, and we do this proactively. Now, on the average of 5 million people a day, practically, if we do this for 30 days, that's 5 million times 30, that's 150 million tests a month effectively, if we invert the positivity curve. Now, if we do pooled testing, meaning that we put 2 samples in one, and if one of them is positive, we ask both to quarantine. It's inconvenient, but we can do it once for a month. We've done it for many months. And if the resulting sample is negative, this means both are negative. So if we just double pool the test, then we have 2 times 150 million tests a month effectively. So that's 300 million people a month. So in 1 month, we go through the entire USA, and we only test those who are high risk score, and those are the ones who need to be quarantined, and the rest do not need to be quarantined because they don't carry the virus and won't affect others. So we do this quarantine for another 30 days, and after that, basically, the pandemic is eradicated. To recap, the difference between inverting the curve and flattening the curve is that flattening the curve requires high number, very high, practically unachievable number of tests, and these tests are random. Inverting the curve, low samples, low number of tests, and the samples are highly biased. The cost is high for flattening the curve, and we are reactive, whereas the cost is lower, and we do it actively for inverting the curve. For tracing, we do manual contact tracing for flattening the curve, and we do it after the infection. But for inverting the curve, we do it in an automated way, and we do risk scores. and it's done before the infection. And finally, the frequency during pandemic. For flattening the curve, we have to keep doing it repeatedly, testing people over and over and over, because in principle, they could get infected on the way out of the test centers. Whereas inverting the curve, we have to test once. We sweep through the entire population of the US and we test people only once. Thank you.